This is Nick Redding, and you're listening to PreserveCast, a podcast with a worldwide listenership that explores the broad world of preservation from every angle, from drones to mudlarking and everything in between. Now, let's get preserving. On this week's PreserveCast, we're diving deep into the technology of preservation with Greg Gaylor and Taryn Williams about their roles at the Association for Preservation Technology International. We're talking about how preservationists keep up with changing technology and how those trends, tools, and the science of buildings is helping keep our historic structures standing. And we'll discuss how you can get involved and learn more about the science behind preservation. This is Nick Redding, and you're listening to PreserveCast. Today, we're excited to be talking with two folks. We have on two guests today, Greg Gaylor and Taryn Williams. Greg and Taryn are both going to talk about their roles with the Association for Preservation Technology, APT, and we're going to be talking all about what APT and APTI and all these different things, how it all comes together, what it is that they do, and why you should know more about it. Greg is the Executive Director of APT, and Taryn is the President of the Board of APT, and is also an accomplished Senior Project Manager at Simpson, Gumpertz, and Heeger. And we're going to be talking about what that is and how they both got into this line of work. But before we get there, maybe we'll start there, which is their path to preservation and to this organization. So maybe we'll start with Taryn. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up, and what was your first job in the field? What sparked all this interest, and how'd you get into it?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I grew up in upstate New York, just north of Albany, and I went to school at Cornell University for both my undergraduate program in civil engineering and my graduate program also in civil engineering. And the way I got into preservation was I had a summer internship in Princeton, New Jersey, in between undergrad and grad school. And I worked for an engineering company. And I would take the train to New York quite a bit to do condition surveys of buildings owned by Columbia University. They were masonry buildings. And as I was doing that work, I started to become interested in historic preservation, in older buildings, and in how we work with them. So after that internship, when I went back to grad school at Cornell, I signed up for a couple of courses in the architecture school in the Department of Planning, and took a couple of preservation courses and really learned about preservation theory and some materials conservation methods. One of the highlights of that experience is that my professor in one of those preservation courses is now on my board of directors, which is absolutely delightful.
And so where was your first job in the field?
So after graduate school, I moved to San Francisco to start my first job with a structural engineering firm doing earthquake engineering. And after a couple of years there, it was a great experience, but I wasn't doing a whole lot of preservation, which I was really interested in. And so I moved over to my current firm at Simpson, Gumpertz & Heeger and started working with an expert in the field who did a lot of preservation work. And she taught me everything I know about preservation practice. And so that was 2003, and I've been doing that work ever since.
And so SGH Engineering, I'll say sort of jokingly, in the interest of full disclosure, we at Preservation Maryland, which powers PreserveCast, has had a long and really positive relationship with them. And they're really one of the leaders in the field when it comes to preservation and saving buildings that others think are too far gone. Like that's sort of like, I always sort of joke that that's like their thing. We bring them in when someone's like, no, that can't be saved. And I'm like, well, SGH probably can figure it out. And so we have saved things that have been damaged by floods, things that have been hit by cars, you name it. Somehow they come up with some crazy strategy. And with the right amount of money, you can save almost anything. Isn't that right?
That's right.
So Greg is a repeat here. We've had him on before, and actually last time we talked to him, he was back in Boston, and we were talking about modernism, I think it was, or defensive brutalism. We put him on the hot seat and made him defend the indefensible. He's good at that. But now he's got this great new gig, not even that new anymore, but with APTI, the Association for Preservation Technology International, and we'll talk about what all that means. But Greg, remind people where you grew up and what was sort of your path into this interesting world of preservation.
Sure, yeah. I was born in Boston, grew up in an adjacent suburb. And actually, in hindsight, the seeds in my interest were planted way back in junior high, where I had a teacher that was really smart and said, get your nose out of the textbook, go hop on your bikes. We didn't have licenses at that point, and go look at some stuff. So we took some field trips, but also I looked at some really interesting historic sites, including some old industrial sites. So that kind of got planted in the back of my head. But as an undergrad, I thought I wanted to major in physics and math. That was fine until the 5-hour problem sets really kind of got to me. Realizing that someone had figured out all those solutions hundreds of years before me. And I took a class with a guy named Pat Malone, who's since retired from Brown, but a leader in the field of industrial history and industrial archaeology. And I took a class in the history of the built environment. And suddenly I realized that I could actually connect my interest in science and math with a long-standing love of history. And I ended up doing an undergraduate thesis on 19th century bridge building and its influence on early iron and steel framing. And I found that I could actually do work as a researcher. That undergraduate thesis was actually used by state historic preservation offices throughout New England. And that was far more rewarding than problem sets that someone had figured out long before that. So that was really, I was bit by the bug then in actually getting out in the field and doing work. So my first job was actually as an undergraduate. I was paid to work with him to develop and complete a survey of historic resources in the Blackstone River Valley National Historic Corridor. It was one of the first national historic corridors. So actually working with historic resources of all types out in the field and doing, background research on them and then doing some analysis of them. And then my first job out of college was coordinator of industrial history at the Valentine Museum in Richmond, Virginia, where I collected a bunch of machinery. My focus was really industrial history and history of technology. And then before long, I was leading a project to convert a 19th century ironworks in Richmond to a new museum.
So two interesting and diverse paths into preservation, but APT brought you together. So APT is the common denominator here between both of you. So maybe since Greg's the executive director at APT, you could tell us, what is APT?
Well, there's the formal mission of APT, which is to advance appropriate traditional and new technologies to care for, protect, and promote the longevity of the built environment, and to cultivate the exchange of knowledge through the international community. But that's quite a mouthful, as many mission statements are. I like to say we support the experts in both the historic and most current methods to take care of and assure the longevity of historic places. Taryn will have her own short summary, but briefly, APT was formed in 1968, jointly between the U.S. and Canada. We now have members in about 30 countries, 21 chapters, and a full breadth of experience that we can talk about further.
And Taryn, maybe we'll move in that direction. How would you describe it as a practitioner? And maybe not just how you would describe it, but what value does it bring to you? As somebody who's a practitioner, or somebody listening to this is like, oh, well, I do that kind of work. Maybe I should be a member and I'm not. What's the value add to being a part of all of this?
Yeah, what APT does is it provides the best technical resources to practitioners in historic preservation. So those are architects, engineers, materials conservators, professors, contractors, students. APT is the place you come when you need to know the best tools and technology in order to preserve a material or a structure. So we do that in a variety of ways. One of our main communication methods is our peer-reviewed journal, The Bulletin, and that comes out 3 times a year. It's a member benefit, and you can also access it online through JSTOR, which has a host of other scientific journals. But the APT Bulletin is the premier technical resource for practitioners in preservation. So being a member of APT gives you access to a network of professionals who are experts in the field. And this is really what APT is all about. We provide technical resources to people who are preserving buildings. And we're really a partner and a resource for people who focus on advocacy, on tax credits, and on policy.
So maybe give me an example of that. So for somebody listening who isn't a practitioner of this and is like thinking to themselves, well, how much does the technology of historic structures and preserving historic structures, how could it possibly change that much? Now, I know, and you guys both know, that it does. But for somebody listening who, they work in a museum and they work in public history and they're not super familiar with this aspect of it, how give me an example, if you could, of like a place where your research has sort of changed the understanding. Is there like a cool example or something you can think of that maybe it was covered in the journal? I don't know if Taryn or either of you want to take this, but something where you're like, oh, this definitely changed our understanding and we're doing a better job of it now because of this kind of research.
Yeah, well, I'll give you an example and I'll ask Greg to expand on it. But one of the recent things that is coming up quite a bit is the issue of codes, building codes for historic buildings, both in the IBC, the International Building Code, which is mostly for new construction, and the IEBC, which is the International Existing Building Code. APT has had a committee on codes and standards for a very long time, working to understand and improve the codes for handling buildings. And it really impacts downtown areas with older buildings that would like to be reused, but a lot of the codes appear to be pretty restrictive. And so just recently we had a virtual seminar called Building Codes on Main Street that Greg can talk about a bit more, and the folks who attended that.
Yeah, I mean, codes is one example. So when we say, technology, it really runs a huge spectrum. So just in terms of the context, I mean, people in APT involved in everything from the microscopic analysis of mortar and paint through, giant steel and structural engineering and giant stones, and across the historic period from prehistoric to, mid-century modern and concrete. And technology is pretty broadly defined. So on the codes issue, who else is going to get down in the weeds and get excited about building codes than APT people? Most people's eyes rolls on the back of their head when you say building codes. But the reality is that building codes are one of the biggest barriers to building reuse, particularly in the affordable housing realm, and particularly on sort of main streets where you think of, retail first floor and all those unoccupied second and third floors. And the issue that they're not being occupied and could be great affordable housing is often building codes. And the building codes is very technical. And the international existing building code was actually developed with support from HUD to reduce barriers to building reuse. But over the past 30 years, layer upon layer of increased codes have been added. But with new technologies, for example, there are things called intumescent paints, which can be used to increase fire ratings for materials. New types of fire protection systems that can reduce the costs, and some other new methodologies, and also the way we analyze buildings in terms of computer analysis and so forth, are much more sophisticated and would really allow safe reuse of buildings if the building codes would allow it. So that's one way we're working on trying to get those codes changed. The other thing is there are people at APT who are experts in using the performance-based code, which is within the existing building code, really doesn't require changes, but requires people to better understand how to use it. And that's rather than just sort of fixed numbers and fixed requirements, you can actually do some testing to demonstrate that your building in its current form performs safely and meets the code. But sadly, many even code officials don't understand how this works. So you need experts to work on it. So that's one example in the codes realm.
So I always have to stop people. And part of my job is to ask questions when there's phrases thrown out that I have no clue about, that I'm sure listeners have no clue about. What is an intumescent paint, Greg?
Yes, it's a great name. I just love throwing it around.
It is.
It's a type of paint that's designed when it's exposed to heat. Its chemistry and physical nature changes to provide it slows down the ability of heat and flame to reach the surface below it.
Fascinating. So it almost turns kind of into a fire barrier when it gets hot.
Effectively, yes. And I will note, in case there are certain people at the Park Service listening, and we can talk about some of those issues later, that it's not applicable in all situations.
Sure. Well, yes, we're not providing technical guidance. We never provide accounting or tax accounting advice or anything like that.
My lawyer appreciates the caveat.
This is just informational. So speaking of informational, we've talked about sort of the trends and challenges. Sounds like codes is a big thing. I mean, anybody who works in rehab, is familiar with that. mention sometimes that Preservation Maryland powers this podcast. And, we ran into a million issues trying to rehab a log cabin. Actually, SGH worked on that project with us. And trying to take a cabin and make it so that it met modern code, even though someone was living in it because of the rehab work that was being done. And there were moments when we wanted to bang our head against the wall, against the log wall. But I'm curious, one thing that pops up that people might be familiar with, particularly people who kind of work in this industry or kind of bounce around in preservation, we hear a lot about the Secretary of the Interior standards, right? So you've got these standards that are established that go back almost 50 plus years at this point. And some aspects of them are good, some are not so good. And we have buildings that now are eligible for the National Register that were built in, 1973. And how are you guys sort of dealing? Are you engaging with Secretary of the Interior standards? Do you have advocacy pushes on this? Are you sort of thinking through ways that they could be changed? I'm seeing Greg smirk a little bit. This is an audio podcast, so you're not seeing it, but want to let the listeners know. What is the challenge here? I mean, this is obviously sort of a big issue out there. I'm curious where APT is on this. I don't know who wants to take that one.
APT has not been specifically engaging this issue in great detail. I was smirking because, you and I know, Nick, you and I talk in full disclosure, we are connected through the the National Preservation Partners Network and talk on different levels on those kind of issues. APT is not engaged on the Secretary of Standards too much. It is politically challenging, and there's two camps. There's the code, the standards are fine, and it's all about interpretation camp. And there's you say that, but you still are giving us challenges interpreting the codes the way we think we need, the standards the way we need to camp. I think for APT, where we see the challenge mostly with code specifically is in modern buildings. So, you have to admit, I think anyone would admit that the codes didn't particularly anticipate mid-century modern and concrete in some of the challenges with those repair and maintenance. I think in those types of buildings, there are APT members who are expert in those fields, and Taryn might want to speak to that and may have some specific examples where there are some challenges with the code, with the standards. But it's really about dialogue with the SHPO office and the people in the Park Service, the people overseeing those standards. And I think that's a place where APT can play a role. We haven't yet and haven't been asked to, but we are having increasing conversations with the Park Service more broadly about our ability to provide some guidance. And I think that's a place where we can provide some expert advice saying, you need to provide more flexibility because, X and Y regarding the materials or changes in materials or new technologies or new materials that have evolved.
And that's only going to get more challenging. Yeah, I want to kick it over to Taryn, but it's only going to get more challenging. We were talking in our office a couple days ago about, I guess it's 2030, something built in 1980 is going to be eligible for the National Register, right? And so, the building materials of 1980, to Greg's point, like the Secretary of the Interior standards never really envisioned, 1980s mall, the adaptive reuse of that. And I think it's interesting. I think it's an important point too, that you guys don't have an official position on it. You're not working on it particular, but that there this idea of dialogue. And I think that that's important in all preservation, is like actually just having conversations instead of talking past each other. But I think Greg's point is well made on like having dialogue about interpretation of this. But Taryn, I'm curious how you kind of see this as a practitioner.
Yeah, Greg is correct that APT has historically not been involved in advocacy issues in general, and we're just starting to become involved in advocating for certain issues on the federal level that have to do with preservation more broadly. So we've not yet engaged a lot in this conversation about the Secretary of Interior standards, but we're certainly aware of the conversation. And the first thing I'll say about the standards is that they are guidelines. They are not law. They are not code. So they are a tool that are used by state historic preservation officers, by tribal historic preservation officers, and others in order to make decisions where there are very nuanced situations about retaining building features, preserving buildings, upgrading buildings, etc. So they're written broadly, and there's a lot of room for interpretation. They were written at a point in time when some materials we have today or some systems we have today didn't exist. And there may be certain situations where they don't quite adequately cover some of what we're coming up against. But I also think that's debatable. And I think about an example of, say, mid-century modern or postmodern buildings with architectural systems that don't have great waterproofing systems. I've looked at many of these, including in postmodern buildings that are now reaching age 50 and qualifying for historic status. And the cladding systems don't involve a complete waterproofing system behind it, for example, or there are discontinuities in the waterproofing. When we talk about how to preserve these buildings in a way that respects their architectural integrity. The Secretary of Interior Standards prioritizes retaining historic fabric first and foremost, but they also allow for choices of replacing it when need be. And these may be times when we need to replace materials in order to provide more durability to the building and provide an appearance that matches the architectural intent. So there are many kinds of criteria we can look at when making decisions about how to repair or upgrade buildings. It comes up a lot in mid-century and postmodern structures, particularly with roofing and cladding systems when it comes to waterproofing, as an example. And I don't believe that the standards are terribly restrictive in that, but it requires interpretation that's probably different than what we're used to. So as you said, Nick, it requires a conversation between the authority having jurisdiction and the practitioner about the decisions they're making for the project.
So why don't we take a break here, and when we come back, we'll talk about a great place where you can have those conversations, which is when APT gets together annually, and we'll do that here on PreserveCast. Talk about other ways you can get engaged with APT, and we're talking with Greg Gaylor and Taryn Williams. Historic preservation can't happen without skilled tradespeople to perform the work, and there's a critical need right now for those tradespeople. The Campaign for Historic Trades, powered by Preservation Maryland, is working to meet that need by strengthening apprenticeship opportunities within historic trades. In partnership with the National Park Service's Historic Preservation Training Center and Conservation Legacy, the campaign is currently recruiting for NPS Traditional Trades Apprenticeship Program, or TTAP. TTAP's an intensive 20-week apprenticeship that provides young adults the chance to learn historic trade skills while working on America's most iconic historic sites. Multiple positions are open for the 2022 season at national parks across the country. Visit historictrades.org for more information on TTAP and how to apply today. This is Nick Redding. You're listening to PreserveCast. We're excited to have you back. We're having a great conversation today with two leaders in the Association for Preservation Technology International, Greg Gaylor, their Executive Director, and Taryn Williams, the President of their board. And before we took our break, we were talking about like having these dialogues, having conversations, ways in which APT is shaping the narrative and sort of doing research on different difficult issues when it comes to dealing with restoring and historic preservation of buildings from, the 18th century or earlier internationally to the mid-century modern and postmodern. And I sort of led before we took the break with this idea that there's a great place where you can have all these conversations, and at the risk of being a little rude, you can nerd out with your fellow building scientist people and preservationists. And Greg, where might that take place on a regular basis?
Well, there's constantly places you can do it. We do regular webinars and all sorts of esoteric topics like linseed oil and plywood and building papers and paint. And one of my favorites was scagliola. I bet you've never heard of that one, Nick.
Scagliola?
Yeah, which is a full...
I went to high school with him.
Yeah, it's a full marble technique that was fascinating to learn about. I totally geeked out on all our webinars. So anyway, if people are interested in, fascinating things they never heard of regarding historic buildings, or things they heard of but always wondered how they worked, we have regular online webinars. There's actually one coming up on concrete conservation, repair, and reinvestment training, which will be in mid-April. I'm not sure when we're being broadcast, but that may be too late for that. But registration on that's opening soon. But the big place that you were teeing me up for is our annual conference.
Yes.
We'll be in Seattle from October 9 to 14th. Registration opening soon. There'll be, last year we were in Detroit and we had about 80 paper sessions. I'm not sure the number we're going to land on this year. We'll have field sessions to bring people out to look at historic sites and talk about them, and some hands-on workshops as well. So all that's in development now.
So there's ways to digitally engage. From what I understand, it doesn't involve watching the concrete dry, but you can learn all about the concrete, which is good. And I joke, but actually I just got an email last week asking about, I need to learn more about concrete preservation, and I actually sent them over to APT. So there you go. So it is a huge resource, and, it fills a vacuum. Like, there's not a lot of people talking about this issue of the science of buildings and how all these things come together. And obviously there's online components to it, and then there's the in-person piece as well. Maybe you can sponsor PreserveCast to come out and cover it in person. And Greg, do you have some other thoughts on sort of like getting together with these sorts of issues and places where people can have these conversations?
Yeah, a couple of additional things people should know about. Our website, apti.org, has a number of free resources to non-members that include something called practice points, which are a little bit parallel to the Park Service technology briefs on specific issues, but they're not particularly long. They're good sort of high level to medium level on various topics. We have our Building Technology Heritage Library, which is one of my favorites, and others can't see, but as you can see, a great source for backgrounds for virtual meetings. But old catalogs of different technologies, from terracotta to lighting to tiles to paint to lots and lots of old house plans. They're amazing resources for practitioners. And I was going to also mention our chapters. And we have chapters throughout the world. You're in Maryland. We have a DC chapter. We have a Delaware Valley chapter that's not too far away. Taryn, do you want to say anything about chapters or anything else?
Well, Nick asked about getting together, and I wanted to highlight some of the other ways in which we do get together. The big event is our annual conference, of course, but we do have in-person and virtual workshops throughout the year. And we also have committees. We have 21 committees at APT, 6 of which are technical committees. And so these are the committees doing the bulk of the work to develop and advance the technology to preserve historic structures. So those committees include the Technical Committee on Modern Heritage, which is putting on the concrete repair seminar in a couple of weeks, the Technical Committee on Codes and Standards, the Preservation Engineering Technical Committee, because it requires a certain level of sensitivity when dealing with structural or mechanical aspects of a building to preserve it without destroying it. We have the Technical Committee on Sustainable Preservation, which really deals with the intersection of sustainability and preservation. And I think we should talk more about that on the next point. We have the Technical Committee on Materials, which puts on monthly webinars that are currently free to anyone about the things that Greg mentioned earlier, the linseed oil, the plaster, the paints. So you can really nerd out there. And let's see, there's the 6th, the Technical Committee on Documentation. So this committee handles LiDAR scanning, laser scanning, all of the ways in which we document historic buildings. So this is where the technological development and the forefront development really happens.
Yeah, there are just like a ton of ways to get engaged. And we're going to put links in the show notes here so people can click on it. They can join APT. They can go and hang out with their local chapter. I know I'm always getting things about cool stuff and linseed oil and all these different things that are happening in the Delmarva. And I joke about this, but really, when it comes down to doing this work with these buildings, there's few other places where you can have these conversations. And if you have also just like a specific question about something, the chapters are a great place to kind of engage with that or find an expert who can help you in your region as well. I guess maybe a question to kind of like, what are you guys working on next? Like, where are you headed? I don't know if Taryn wants to take that one, like sort of the big things that are happening.
Yeah, one thing I'll mention coming back to an earlier topic is the intersection of sustainability and preservation, which is something that we in APT understand very well as an inherent partnership and overlap. The most sustainable building, the greenest building, is the one that's already there. So when we're considering options between tearing down an existing building and building a new one that might have a great LEED rating versus preserving an existing one and looking at those two options, many times the preservation will result in lower carbon footprint, lower energy expenditure, et cetera. And so there are people outside of the preservation space who don't think of these things together, but it's what the work of our Technical Committee on Sustainable Preservation involves. And right now, as an example, we're partnering with GBC Italia, which is the Italian Green Building Council equivalent of the US GBC, the Green Building Council. Right now in the LEED system, if you're going to reuse an existing building, I think you get 2 points out of, this whole list of 100 and more. But GBC Italia has developed a protocol to really recognize the value of preserving a historic building and to give more credit to reuse of all of those items. So we're working on helping them to internationalize this standard and bring it over into the US and beyond. So that's one place. I think Greg can talk more about his experience with sustainability.
Yeah, another thing we're involved in that, Nick, you've probably already talked about somewhere along the line, is the CARE tool, the Carbon Avoided Retrofit Estimator. I don't know if you talked to anyone about
We
that.
haven't had it on PreserveCast yet. It's definitely sort of something that we're working on, but you can definitely whet people's appetite with it.
Yeah, so if people go to caretool.org, this is something that we and other organizations help support, something our sustainability group is working on. It really, brings some numbers. So as Taryn mentioned, the greenest building is the one that's already there. Building reuse is climate action, whichever tag phrase you want to use. We've been saying it in the field for a long time, but we've had trouble sort of putting data to it. And this tool lets you put in some basic information about a building and demonstrates that the embodied carbon in that building is significant. And it does some calculations and plots some graphs to show that if you were to replace this building with a new building, even a net zero building, how long it would take to make up for all that lost embodied carbon, which is often 75 to 80 years. And with improvements in building systems with existing buildings, there's some new studies that show that you may never make up the loss of that existing building. So that is an area that, we're actively working on. As you know, Nick, one of the challenges is, within the field, getting people to understand these things. And then there's the general public and outside the field. We're seeing a growing awareness of the power of embodied carbon and the value of existing buildings within the field. AIA is recognizing it more. Some of their numbers show that, their members, AIA, the American Institute for Architects, for those who don't know, their billable hours are increasingly on, reuse of existing buildings and modification of existing buildings. So within the design field, it's starting to be recognized, but it's the general public challenge that we need to work on. I hate to slam anyone publicly, but I will. But if I hear another Anderson window ad saying that you should replace all your windows and it's going to save all the energy that you're wasting because your old building's old, I'm going to scream.
They're actually the sponsor of today's episode. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, there you go.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
But as a preservation field, we're collectively working on sort of better messaging. The other thing I'll say I'm working on is that relatively new executive director, I've been at APT a year, is making us less of a hidden gem. When I go to talk to some of my former colleagues I worked with in Boston that are working with historic buildings every day, they don't necessarily know about APT, typically because they hire someone like Simpson, Gumpertz, and Hager. They hire SGH to do the work, and the people at SGH, like Taryn, get all the information from APT. But we need more people involved in preservation to know that we are, a critical resource that underlies the whole field.
Right. And I think there's, I'll admit my confusion on it is that I always thought APTI meant that it was just like an international thing. And it's not. It's one thing. It covers the United States, but it also covers other places. But when you hear APTI, it does not mean it's an international group. It is ours and others as well. Is that right?
Well, let me clarify that for you, Nick. I'm glad you brought that up. And in fact, this is something we've been talking about at the board in recent years because there has been that confusion. So the name of the organization is the Association for Preservation Technology International. And when the organization was founded between American and Canadian members, they chose the abbreviation as APT. or APT International. Nowadays, so it's the same thing. Nowadays, now that we have many chapters, we will use the APTI abbreviation to distinguish chapters from the parent organization, which are all separate organizations affiliated with APT International, or to emphasize the international nature of our work, because when we started, it was a joint American-Canadian organization, and now we have a variety of international chapters, including Latin American and Caribbean, Europe, and South Asia. So we also have Australasia. So we've been all over the place for quite a long time. So APT and APTI are the same organization.
It's a good clarification. Well, as we kind of come to a conclusion here, rather, we've asked what you guys are working on next. We've talked about ways to engage. We've learned a little bit about the organization and about you. And now we ask, Greg knows this, he's been on before. We asked your favorite historic place or site. We asked Greg that before, so we can't ask him the same one. So maybe we'll say, what was the most recent historic place? Not your house, but the most recent historic place that you visited purposefully.
Oh, that's not fair. I prepared an answer because I don't remember what
Well, if you prepared an answer, by all means, I don't mean to get in the way of this.
People who know me well know I hate the "what is your favorite" question.
Yeah, that's why we ask it.
If people ask me what's my favorite pizza, I say, well, it depends. So I don't know what I told you last time. And if you ask me the question 10 times, I'll probably give you 10 different answers. So
I love it.
Today, my favorite historic place is the Boston Public Library. Built in 1895, McKim, Mead, and White. And part of the reason I mention it today is because it does have a nerdy, esoteric APT-related aspect, which is it is full of gorgeous Guastavino vaults. And if you don't know about Guastavino, go to Ellis Island, go to many historic buildings, go to the Michigan Central Station in Detroit being restored. So the Boston Public Library, I can wax poetic, but I'll stop there.
That's a great place. Taryn?
I always have trouble with favorite questions because I have a lot of favorite things. But since I had this in advance, I thought about the top 3 kinds of historic places I like, because historic places all the time. But first and foremost is any place that has Guastavino vaulting.
We didn't plan that.
Wow.
No.
This is, we'll have to do a whole episode just on Guastavino and then Scagiola.
I think that we should, and we can connect you with the right person to talk about Guastavino.
I bet.
But this is a vaulting technique using very thin tiles in just a couple of layers to create a dome or a vault that has immense compression loading capacity. And they're beautiful. When you look at them from below, you see a very characteristic herringbone pattern. And so I went to the Boston Public Library with Greg for the first time last year, and he said, they have a room called the Guastavino Room. And I was like, oh, and he said, let's go there now. So any place with Guastavino vaulting, one of my favorite things to look at. Second favorite thing is cobblestone streets. I just love them. There aren't very many in DC where I live, but they're all over Philadelphia. They're all over, plenty of places. And I love them. They're impractical these days, but I love them. There was one in Ithaca, New York, that has now been destroyed, but it was part of a project that I did in my graduate class. And the third is abandoned rail lines around Paris. Any kind of abandoned rail lines, really, but there is one in Paris called the Petite Ceinture that surrounds the city, and they have been redeveloping parts of it as a park. But some of it is still off limits, and those are the places I've gone in with friends in Paris to have a look at. The railroad, there are actually secret entrances to the catacombs in some of the tunnels, and so we've gone down in there at night looking around, and it's absolutely fascinating.
Well, I would expect no better answer from 2 preservation professionals who are outstanding in their field to wrap up this episode. It's been fun talking with you guys. Looking forward to hearing more about where APTI heads, and also keeping an eye out for all the information about your upcoming events. And we'll put links in the show notes to all of this so people can engage with APT. And thanks so much for joining us today. It's been fun having both of you with us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. We appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to preservecast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland. It's sponsored by the 1772 Foundation and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.